Harlem News, and I am your anchor, Jocelyn.
And I'm your co-anchor, Kyle.
Today's segment will be about the crisis. We'll be reporting about its impact, its background, and then we'll be going to a live report from NAACP headquarters with Ricky Martinez. The Crisis is a magazine founded by the NAACP. The first issue of The Crisis was published in November 1910, and the last published issue was in October 1923. Between this time period, The Crisis had a major impact during what we know as the New Negro Movement, or as most majority as the Harlem Renaissance that occurred. The first form of impact that the magazine had was creating a platform for Black writers and artists. The Crisis includes articles on current events, editorial commentary, essays on culture and history, short stories and poems, reviews, artworks, and reports on the achievements of people of color worldwide. Editorial commentary were often about court cases, political legislation that directly affected African Americans. For example, Volume 6 talks about Democrat Woodrow Wilson, who received more African American votes than any other previous Democratic presidential candidate, and in 1913, President Woodrow Wilson mandated racial segregation into federal government agencies. This meant that African American employees were separated from other workers in offices, restrooms, and cafeterias, and some blacks were often demoted or fired. It was and the Crisis also talks about court cases where there was an anti-lynching bill that was proposed, as well as being an advocate for the Black voice, as it provided a platform for African Americans being the first form of self-expression and talking and being an opinion piece against the second emergence of the Ku Klux Klan. Moving on to my co-anchor, he's going to be talking about the background of the magazine The Crisis and what that's about.
Okay, so for starters, The Crisis was created by the NAACP, and for those that don't know, one of the major factors in The Crisis is the editor, W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, the purpose of this magazine was so that there be the world-old dream of human brotherhood, and by bearing witness in the dangers of race prejudice and reporting on the great problems of interracial relations, both at home and abroad. Now, the magazine thus provided it corrected all racial stereotypes and silences of mainstream media at the time. Now, the reason for this is because majority of mainstream media was all based off Caucasian background and influences on the perspective of whites against blacks. And it negatively portrayed African Americans in such a way that, next thing you know, you had very racial ties against each other, showing that there was no even ground. And The Crisis showed that this is the truth, that there are struggles, but we are just as equal in what we do and what we say. Now, for example, if you were to look at it, it's like how we look at past other news, where it may seem one way, but the reality is that it's the other. What I mean by that is that you can have a bunch of friends telling you this one story about your other friend being very horrible, and that they are not a right person to hang out with. They have a bunch of issues with them. They can't be trusted. But then when you hear from your friend, you hear that backstory of that, knowing that they were wrongly peer pressured into doing something that they didn't want to, or they're not, as they would say, being treated equal because they feel inferior, and knowing that they didn't have any equal say in what was going on. And so that was the key purpose of The Crisis. And now we'll be going to our other reporter, Ricky Martinez.
Thanks, Kyle. Thanks, Jocelyn. I'm out here outside the NAACP headquarters. One of the major events that molded our country into what it is today was the foundation of the NAACP in 1905. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People was founded in New York City by a group of biracial activists. Originally called the National Negro Committee, it is the nation's oldest civil rights organization. One often overlooked aspect of the NAACP's history is that the Jewish community contributed hugely to the NAACP's funding and continued financing. A main emphasis of the NAACP was their position against Booker T. Washington, a man who urged African Americans to accept the segregation and give in to the unjust ways. The NAACP first wanted to make whites aware of the need for racial equality. The group launched a program of speech-making, lobbying, and publicizing the issue of racial discrimination and inequality in housing, education, employment, voting, and transportation. It also launched The Crisis, a magazine edited for 25 years by W.E.B. Du Bois. It appealed to the Supreme Court to rule as unconstitutional to several laws passed by the Southern states, and beginning in 1915, won several important judgments regarding housing and voting rights. In 1916, the NAACP began to expand its membership into the South under the leadership of Field Secretary James Weldon Johnson, where the organization faced its most fierce opposition. By 1920, by which Johnson became the first black executive secretary, membership had grown to 90,000, half of which was in the South. The NAACP began to publicize the evil of the Jim Crow laws that sanctioned racial discrimination and fought for a federal anti-lynching law. In the 1920s and the 1930s, the NAACP devoted much of its time and energy into publicizing the lynching of blacks throughout the United States. In conjunction with the anti-lynching campaign in 1920, the NAACP began flying a flag from the windows of its headquarters at 69th and 5th Avenue when a lynching occurred. The words on the flag were, "A man was lynched yesterday." The threat of losing its lease forced the NAACP to discontinue the tradition in 1938. The original canvas flag is housed in the NAACP records in the Library of Congress Manuscript Division. To show the world what the members of the organization would not be intimidated, it held its annual conference in 1920 in Atlanta, Georgia, considered to be, at the time, one of the most active Ku Klux Klan areas in the nation. In 1948, the NAACP pressured President Harry Truman into signing an executive order to ban discrimination by the federal government. And then in 1950, the NAACP began its campaign against the legal doctrine that separate but equal schools for black and white children were constitutional. The Supreme Court had ruled that separate schools were acceptable as long as they were separate but equal. The NAACP set out to prove that separate facilities provided to black students were not equal to those provided for whites. One study in 1937 revealed that school spending on pupils in the South was $37.87 per white pupil, compared to $13.08 per black pupil. 5 desegregation lawsuits were launched in different states. That's all I have. Back to you guys.
Thank you, Ricky. Oh, and special shout out to our sponsor, Dr. Bryson Patel. Here's a link to his website where he shows us a bunch of information that we source out to.
And that concludes our segment, Harlem. I hope you guys have a good night. Thank you for tuning in.
Go.
Good afternoon. Ooh, Lord have mercy. Good afternoon, Harlem. This is Harlem News, and I am your anchor, Jocelyn.
And co-anchor, Kyle.
And today's segment will be about the crisis. Good afternoon, Harlem. This is Harlem News, and I am your anchor, Jocelyn.
And co-anchor, Kyle.
And today's segment will be about the crisis. We will be reporting about... Ricky, I need you to get under control. Good afternoon, Harlem. This is Harlem News, and I am your anchor, Jocelyn. Damn. Wow.
Wow.
Kyle. Going on to my co-anchor, he will be talking about the background about the magazine The Crisis.
Okay, so for the background, for starters, The Crisis was created by the NAACP. Now, the first editor of The Crisis was W.E.B. Oh, God.
Yeah, that's gonna be chopped out.
W.E.B.
Thanks, Kyle. Thanks, Jocelyn. So I'm out here. Wait, damn it. Thanks, Jocelyn. Thanks, Kyle. I'm out here outside of the NCAA by a group of biracial activists, originally called the New Negro Committee. Oh, I messed that up.